In a way, it ends where it begins.
Very insightful.
Thank you for sharing this Red Baron with us, Linda. It's so tasty, it makes me want to share something of my own. I didn't actually read the book.
Me neither.
I watched the movie last night.
I judged it by its cover.
I haven't read a book since middle school.
I'm secretly seeing 2 other book clubs.
And I can't even read.
I'm not really Gary. He just paid me to be here. Sharing Red Baron pizza can lead to more sharing.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Welcome to the FowlWeather Podcast 2024 Wetland Management Series. Previously thought as inconsequential to duck populations, only thought of as the season of harvest, the fall migration, winter period, and spring migration were not given much thought towards contributing to duck population stability and growth. However, a few moons ago, in spring 1982, the staff of Delta Waterfowl called together a meeting of the best waterfowl minds out there, who then moved forward with the idea that winter was also important to waterfowl, that having resources available to waterfowl was needed in all seasons for their populations to be successful, that we couldn't only focus on the breeding areas, but that they needed to be able to travel south, feed and pair, enough of them survive, and then have enough food to make it through that critical spring period to build back up energy resources to migrate back north and reproduce. The point? Send them back strong. In this series, we are going to provide context about why actively managing restored wetlands is 100% necessary, actually critical. We're going to let you know how you should manage your wetlands, but also why public hunting grounds that you visit should be actively managing their wetlands for waterfowl. The goal of the FowlWeather Podcast Wetland Management Series is to inform the duck hunting community about techniques used on private and public lands to improve non-breeding habitat for ducks. Said another way, our aim is to inform you about how to feed and rest ducks during their fall migration, through winter, and into their spring migration back north to breed. Digging even deeper, the FowlWeather Podcast aims to inform duck hunters how to manage wetlands to just basically kill more ducks, but also provide the food and rest resources needed to conserve ducks. We should never see duck hunting and duck conservation as mutually exclusive. They are intimately linked in our past, and we hope that they are into the foreseeable future. As duck people across duck country, we aim to hunt and conserve ducks, right? We are coupling these activities in the U.S. through the North American model of wildlife conservation, where your dollars are earmarked and go back to conserve the wildlife resources you love. In 1988, a book came out that helped summarize the research to date and the thought processes of the best of the best. It was edited by renowned waterfowl ecologist Milton Weller, but other authors in that book will be much more familiar to most, right? In no particular order, with apology for not including everyone, the authors in this book about wintering waterfowl included Lee Fredrickson, Al Afton, Dennis Raveling, Rick Kaminsky, Bruce Batt, Henry Merkin, Stuart Paulus, Matthew Perry, Jim Nichols, Harold Prince, Dave Ankney, Gary Crepeau, Ken Reinecke, Jim Ringelman, Carl Korshkin, Guy Baldessari, Roger Tittman, and Eric Bolin. I want people listening to understand that these people listed were leaders before me and made a difference in me even being a duck nut that I am, the duck biologist that I am. They're probably the reason that the FowlWeather Podcast even exists. The legacy of these people is simply awesome and ongoing today. That 1988 collection of papers was finally entitled Waterfowl in Winter as a book, and it spawned an entire new generation of interest in wetland management for non-breeding waterfowl. It also led to training of hundreds of students that are now leaders in our field. It led to many people that work for the ducks with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, and DU and Delta, like Mike Brazier, Scott Stevens, Scott Petrie, Luke Naylor, Doug Osborne, Lisa Webb, Mitch Wiegman, and even our own Josh Stiller in New York, and myself. We are academic descendants of Guy Baldessari, who wrote that seminal text, Ducks, Geese, and Swans of North America. The list goes on and on. I'm just naming a few for effect here, of course. Without the history behind us that brought us to where we are today, we couldn't look towards the future of wetlands management for waterfowl. If you have ever questioned the passion of waterfowl biologists of the past for our waterfowl resources, just pick up a copy of Waterfowl in Winter and contemplate the effort that went into that level of understanding of our waterfowl and what they require in winter so they can exist and travel back north strong. If you have ever questioned the passion of current generation waterfowl biologists to continue to focus on waterfowl in the way of the last generation, you should. You should question that. There is no reason to not keep waterfowl as a substantial effort of our conservation actions. Waterfowl populations in general are a huge success. Are they saved forever? No way. They are saved because you, the duck hunter, made your voice known and because passionate waterfowl biologists continue to exist as a voice for the ducks. So why actively manage wetlands for waterfowl? Why not just preserve and protect? Why not restore them and just walk away? Why not just let them function? Why not just fill them with water and then shoot ducks over them? Why not just fill them full of water and then ducks can have a place to feed and rest and then go back strong? So before we get into the timing of moist soil drawdowns in the emergent marsh cycle today, let's talk about why managing wetlands is necessary. The reality is that we live in such a modified system that simply walking away from managing them is typically not possible. If you want to live in the floodplain and farm without fear, if you want to have navigation 100% of the year on the Mississippi River, if you see the Erie Canal as a success in the colonization of this country, if you see all the modifications to waterways as advancement, you must also recognize the scars they bring. The majority of wetland loss was historically in places that ducks migrated in winter. It was in places that were more easily drained in the Mississippi watershed that runs from the southern reaches of Canada, where the Missouri River starts in the west, to the east, where I wet my feet as a child chasing northern pike and smallmouth bass on hot summer days, the Allegheny River. The Allegheny River flows south, meeting the Monongahela in Pittsburgh, becoming the Ohio, and then flowing southwest until meeting the mighty Mississippi. Those rivers and many others have been major travel corridors for ducks, geese, and swans for millennia, but the floodplains around them, the wetlands, were easily drained. These rivers also had regularly flooded, which, although providing vital habitat for wetland wildlife, including ducks, these floods were also substantial barriers to living and farming in the floodplain. So we dug ditches, we drained forests, we cut into this land like it had never seen before. Before we had a full understanding of the benefits of wetlands as places for wildlife, places that filtered our water, provided flood control, before all the recognition of the benefits of wetlands, the federal government turned over land to states that would agree to drain the land. These were the Swamp Land Acts of 1849, 1850, and 1860, a period of rapid population expansion in the U.S. Drained land served as new places to farm. This evolved later into the USDA Agriculture Conservation Program that incentivized the draining of 57 million acres of wetland. 57 million acres of wetland from 1940 to 1977 for agricultural expansion. Wow. Nowadays, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, through the Wetland Reserve Easements Program, works to restore the same wetlands they paid us to drain. The point? We have a long history of wetland destruction in the U.S. that continues today, but let's put some numbers to these changes. For more history on the wetland loss in the Mississippi drainage and Mississippi River engineering, I suggest you read a book called The Great Flood of 1927 and How It Changed America. We also have a bit of history at the beginning of our wetland plant book, A Guide to the Moist Soil Wetland Plants of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley.
My hospital stay would have cost $25,000, but with VA healthcare, it's free.
My education would have cost $42,000, but with VA benefits, my books, tuition, and housing are all covered.
The down payment for my home would have been $74,000, but with my VA home loan, my down payment was $0. My service was then. My benefits are now. Get what you earned. Visit choose.va.gov.
Not all veterans are eligible for the type or amount of benefits mentioned here.
The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 resulted in new engineering approaches to the Mississippi River, and for the first time, the federal government assumed control of regional flood control efforts. The Flood Control Act of 1928 authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to implement a full-scale evaluation. River engineering advanced without thought of environmental damage. Now river engineering included upstream reservoirs, floodways, outlet channels, channel stabilization, and other basin-wide engineering that facilitated river transportation, greatly reduced flood potential, and secured the economic development of the Mississippi River floodplain. In total, 3,700 miles of levees are used to control the Mississippi River, breaking that critical link between nutrient-rich floodwaters and the nearby floodplain wetlands that need them. The ancient Mississippi was gone forever. Gone forever. These stories repeat themselves across the country. The Black Swamp of Ohio, all 3 million acres, was drained into Lake Erie between 1859 and 1885, and drain tile and continued ditching is ongoing today. Nowadays, this area, once rich in wetlands, is flat and primarily a monocrop of corn and soybean rotation. Fertilizer is applied, and western Lake Erie turns green with algal blooms and dies each summer. The Erie Canal, which certainly has been sold as progress, that environmental disaster runs right through my backyard in Jack's Reef, and it destroyed the Great Montezuma swamps. Like many mistakes in our past, the Erie Canal isn't even efficient anymore, running in an annual deficit to the point that the Canal Authority had to be rolled into the Department of Transportation, which includes the interstate system in New York, just so it could stay in the black financially and look good on paper. Oh boy. Anyhow, that's another story altogether. The point of all this history here? U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuges and state wildlife management areas were placed not to preserve the pristine, but save and restore the scars upon our lands that I mention here. We seem to have forgotten that national wildlife refuges and many other protected lands are not pristine wilderness, and that the only way they function is through active and often very aggressive management to combat the damage we have done. We now have an infrastructure in these systems that is nearly impossible to revert. The damage is done, but we can keep these systems functional through active management. When I see the federal government abandoning active management to sustain diverse wetlands for waterfowl, abandoning that management that is needed to sustain diverse wetlands for waterfowl, it makes me think about how the federal government literally paid us to destroy wetlands, then paid us to restore them, but now doesn't want to continue with active management and upkeep that system. You can't do all that damage and then just walk away from it. How do we have so many waterfowl in North America? Why have many waterfowl species done better than other birds? The answer? First, duck hunters that care about ducks. Second, lands dedicated to and actively managed like national wildlife refuges and state wildlife management areas so those birds can survive, go back north, and make more ducks. The history of our approach to wetlands here matters. It matters a lot. I'm not going to dissect all policy towards wetlands, but I hope hitting a few highlights helps you understand what we are up against. So if you see someone acting like actively managing wetlands is not necessary, just remind them that our own federal government once incentivized the destruction of 57 million acres of wetland. Remind them that the last 10 years alone, we still lost a huge proportion of vegetated palustrian marsh, the stuff that ducks use. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Wetland Status and Trends Report for the period 2009 to 2019 just came out this March, and it ain't pretty. This report, while used by biologists like myself, is mostly for Congress as a yardstick to measure the effectiveness of existing laws and policies aimed at protecting wetlands. Over the nearly 70 years covered by the Wetland Status and Trends Report, the country has achieved the no net loss of wetlands goal set forth by George Bush Sr. only once in the early 2000s. The rate of wetland loss has continued to increase since 2004. From 2009 to 2019, a 10-year period, we lost 607,000 acres of freshwater wetlands in the U.S., with most of that being forested wetlands in the southeast U.S. at a staggering loss of 426,000 acres of forested wetland. For effect here, I know this is a controversial topic, so just for comparison of acres, that is all. The Arkansas Game and Fish is working to renovate approximately 13,000 acres of green tree reservoirs in Biomeda Wildlife Management Area, which, if that was full restoration of wetlands, would only equate to about 3% of that forested wetland loss in the last 10 years. Those types of losses can only be battled one way if we want to keep wetland wildlife with us. Okay, first we need to keep conserving and restoring, but once we restore areas, we just need to feed and support more ducks per unit area than we ever have. And we only get there through active management. So what is active management? Active management is hydrological management by removing and adding boards at water control structures at just the right time. It's putting equipment on moist soil units to mimic the disturbance of river flooding that we, the federal government, have removed through a series of levees, floodways, dams, and obstruction of floodwaters. It's actively applying herbicide at the right time and right place to control invasive species that reduce plant diversity and duck foods. It's all this stuff in the management series that we talk about because we're not working with a pristine system. The federal government that screwed up the entire process of the rivers of this country that our ducks rely on also shouldn't be sitting back and watching duck habitat turn into cocklebur. A good friend of mine has always said, I ain't ever seen a duck eat a damn cocklebur. All right, so let's listen in here and not make ducks eat cockleburs. If you have not, this part 2 is a follow-up to part 1 of the FowlWeather Wetland Management series. Please go back a week to catch up. Today we are covering timing of drawdowns, preseason monitoring, and pre-hunting season management. For our northern friends, we also will detail more about the emergent marsh cycle. First today, we cover the timing of drawdowns in your moist soil wetland. As noted in part 1, this can be a dedicated moist soil wetland that receives active management each year to produce seed and tuber-producing plants, or it can be part of the emergent marsh cycle, and that moist soil period of the emergent marsh cycle might last anywhere from about 1 to 3 years. The reality is that timing of drawdowns can't be given a specific date, nor should they be considered similar from south to northern latitudes. Most guides you will see to marsh management provide a designation for early and late drawdowns as the timing since the last spring frost and first fall frost, right? So how long has it been since the last spring frost, and how long will it be till the first fall frost? But my experience suggests these don't hold true as you change latitude or as you move from south to north because the plants are adapted to different day lengths. The barnyard grass in Michigan sees much longer day length per day in summer than barnyard grass in the South Mississippi Delta. So we should expect it can react differently to the same type of drawdown conditions. That said, the typical early drawdown date happens someplace 2 months or less after the last spring frost. That can be pretty early in southern latitudes, right? Late drawdowns are often listed as within the last 90 days of the growing season before a fall frost, but you certainly have a window where you won't get any seed production if you draw down too late. At the latitude of New York, we consider the 1st of August as the drop-dead date for having a drawdown complete and still produce duck foods. I'd certainly get it done earlier than that at northern latitudes if possible because those really late drawdowns typically have reduced food densities. From research that I was involved in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, or MAV, with colleagues, early drawdowns with active soil disturbance that were completed before the 15th of June typically had greater plant diversity than those conducted later in the season, but the likelihood of an invasive species outbreak seemed to be greatest with a fast drawdown in the mid-season. This is that time with hot mud that coffeeweed loves to germinate in. This and other invasives that you don't want and will take effort to get rid of thereafter. For best results, I would remove boards from your water control structure in stages. Starting about 30 days after the last frost, remove a single 6-inch board. Make mud. Let that mud green up, then remove another. Let it green up. Remove another. Let it green up until all that you have left is a small amount of water, mostly in the borrow ditch, and then let it dry out or flood on its own, leaving the boards at that level until late summer. On each of those sections, because the moisture and temperature varies as you do that staggered drawdown, you're likely to get different species of plants. So what is really, really important here is knowing your plants. And if on one of these sections that is greening up, if one or more of those sections are invasive plants, you will need to hit them with herbicide fairly quickly before they get too mature and established. In the heat of summer, when nobody wants to be out on a moist soil unit other than a cottonmouth and a swarm of mosquitoes, a plant like coffeeweed can go from inches to feet in about 5 hot seconds. So don't be lazy, and also learn your plants. It will pay dividends come duck season. Build it and they will come, right? Nope. Not if you don't have duck food. Not all weeds are built the same. So learn your plants or hire someone to help you manage your wetland that does. Now here's the deal. If you dry out your wetland fairly early, you can get a good crop of wild millet. It's most likely going to be barnyard grass or Echinocloa cruzgalli, but it needs to not be outcompeted by broadleaves that don't produce as much duck food that can come on later. So in a really rainy summer, sometimes you get hot mud. Not by your own doing, but because it rained and got really hot while your barnyard grass was still maturing. Yeah, I know, right? So a lot of this has to be monitored as you go. The point is that monitoring is key to catch problem spots early. Later in the season, on those later drawdowns, or if you are still removing boards towards midsummer, really watch for those invasives. But you can also get lots of good stuff, like wild millets that like a little bit more wet than your barnyard grass, right? Barnyard grass is the stuff that comes up in your garden. It likes it dry. But you can get things like jungle rice and Walter's millet, right? Walter's tends to be in those more darker river soils, kind of with abundant organic matter, whereas jungle rice or Echinocloa colonna would be in the main basin, kind of old ag fields turned into moist soil units. On a dry year with a mid-season drawdown, you're going to start to get small seed plants like panic grass, right? On those dry years, you could also get a good crop of pigweed and foxtail, which tends to be really, a drought type plant. It really likes those dry conditions. Other good late season plants include sprangletop and crabgrass. So one of the things I want you to realize is you're hearing maybe a lot of common weed names. And these produce, as we noted in part 1 from annual plants, a lot of abundant small seeds that ducks eat. Ducks are basically weed seed eating specialists. All right, if this all sounds confusing, a couple things to consider. A wildlife consultant is nearly always helpful, right? Number 1. Number 2, if you have multiple units, the best bet is to stagger your drawdowns by date and then monitor mid-season for invasives or plants that aren't going to produce duck food. Number 3, if you have a single unit on a lease, I do drawdowns by removing a single board at a time so that you get that diverse plant community across your wetland, and you're at least going to hit one good band of duck food producing plants. So in part 1, we noted that the biggest mistake that people make is holding water too high during duck season. But that is after the plants have grown. Remember, ducks are short, and if the water is taller than the duck, they won't be able to reach the food you produced. The second big mistake people make is dewatering a wetland all at once and then never coming back to see what is growing. If you aren't on each wetland unit each week or every other week, you're likely going to miss what's happening. And I don't mean like you should drive around and look at your wetland, and pull a board and then move on. I mean, get out and walk the wetland. Again, if you can't do this and you have the financial resources, a wetland manager would be key for you to actually grow duck foods that actually attract ducks to shoot. My experience is that about 90% of hunters that don't have consultation are losing about 50% or more of the capacity of their wetland to attract ducks through adequate food resources. You're also going to need someone on hand that knows how to and can legally spray herbicides to control invasives as they creep into your drawn down wetland. So do your homework in the off season. Again, a word of caution here. Please ensure you follow all federal, state regulations regarding wetlands, water rights, hydrological manipulation, and herbicide applications. These vary by region, and you should probably consult with an expert trained in wetlands management if you are not aware of all that it has to entail in your area. The Foul Weather Podcast is not liable for your poor judgment. So I really think we've covered mid-season monitoring. You also really need to understand that no matter what you do, on some years it can either get really, really dry because it doesn't rain much of the growing season, or it can rain all the time and your plants will react completely differently between those years. So you have control, but not total control. So that is why that mid-season monitoring is so important. Also remember that not all seeds in the soil, the seeds in the seed bank, germinate each year. They wait for just the right conditions and germinate when the moisture and temperature works best for them. So you can get completely different plant communities on the same moist soil unit between years. So always monitor what is coming up and be ready to react mid-season. Okay, on to the pre-hunting season management. Certainly, you can just wait until the plant community shuts down and that super lush vegetation breaks down. But very often, you need to manage the vegetation you grew and water on that vegetation to make the food you produced accessible to ducks you want to attract. In my experience, that pre-hunting season vegetation preparation is much more of a problem the farther north you go because plants tend to have a shorter and later growing season up north and are less likely to have shut down before the first wave of migrants starts south in August and September. At places farther south, your moist soil plants are more likely to have shut down and are dropping seed. So in simple terms, when you are in need of managing vegetation and starting to put water on at northern latitudes, your plants are still trying to grow and are green, whereas by the time ducks get to the south, your plants are usually shut down and brown. So let's start up north. You're going to want to make about 30% of the area open water on a moist soil wetland at the beginning of season when ducks are showing up. This is hard to get when your plants are still green. If you mow openings at this time, you're going to lose duck food because those seeds are not at shatter stage yet. And you're just going to have seeds rot, green seeds rot, before ducks get to them. We suggest rolling large areas because those plants can keep growing and will usually still finish even laying down. This allows, as you put water on, for that water footprint to show. Where there's tall vegetation, the ducks just can't see through that yet. So what you're doing is creating openings in your moist soil vegetation, but not cutting them off at the knees and killing them. You're just rolling large areas. Because you can't re-water and roll at the same time, roll first. Then just bring the water so that the soil under those rolled areas is moist. But don't inundate those plants. This should stimulate plants in the lower wet portion of your unit to start to shut down and set seed. You're going to stress them and make them set seed at this time. Watch the upper portion of your wetland that's a little more dry, right? That 50% that is dry, this portion should not yet see water. And after it starts to brown down, you can mow 50% of that area to make a 50% vegetated to 50% water area. Now you've set the stage of your moist soil unit to receive more water as the season progresses. Again, as noted in part 1, fall mowing and disking or tillage of these units is not preferred because to put equipment on a portion of the unit when it's still dry enough also means you're probably simply tilling down green plants that are potential food that are beneficial. The disking will put some food too deep in the substrate, and much of the other stuff is just going to rot. So be patient at northern latitudes. Try to stress, but not overtop the plants, because that water at their feet will make those plants in those lower elevation portions of the marsh set seed faster. Okay, southern folks, you're pretty lucky because your plants are usually in that brown down stage, that shatter stage. Seeds are set in time before ducks arrive. So my recommendation is to mow down about 50% of that dedicated moist soil unit in a snake and eggs pattern. Kind of drive like you're drunk, right? All right, don't drive a tractor drunk, just in a pattern like you're drunk. So snake and eggs is what it sounds like. Mow an egg-shaped opening, then make a snake path for a distance, then make another egg, then another snake, then an egg, and so on until 50% of your moist soil vegetation is down, and then either flow or pump water onto your unit. The rest of the remaining moist soil vegetation will break down and fall in during the season and continually provide food for ducks for months. This all done, the table is set. In part 4 of the FowlWeather Podcast Wetland Management Series, we will talk about how to manage hunting disturbance to sustain quality duck hunting, as well as some information on hot crops. All right, on to the emergent marsh cycle. Emergent marshes are what it sounds like, and you have to have an abundance of perennial plants that emerge each spring and summer through the water and edges of the wetland as they green up and provide wetland breeding bird habitat, and some produce duck food for the fall. The species vary pretty strongly depending upon your latitude. These include duck food producing plants like arrowhead, water plantain, duck potato, rushes and sedges, and more so in northern areas, large expanses of native, non-native, and sometimes invasive cattail, as well as the highly invasive Phragmites. Thinking back to part 1 of the FowlWeather Podcast Wetland Management Series, if I had multiple units in the south, I'd nearly always keep one unit wet throughout summer, letting some of the area transition into emergent marsh plants and having a deeper area where submerged aquatic vegetation can establish. Your widgeon and gadwall, as well as other dabbling ducks, will certainly use these areas, as well as your nearby duck food dense moist soil units. But mostly the emergent marsh cycle is a northern latitude technique and very often includes the role of muskrats in what is called an eat-out of the marsh. The eat-out is typically cattail that they make their winter huts out of and eat to survive. Let's start this marsh cycle at the stage that has the greatest diversity of breeding birds in general. You will hear the term hemi-marsh for this point in the cycle, which refers to 50% vegetated and 50% open water marsh. But it is technically an incorrect term, because hemi in Latin means half, and marsh means marsh. It literally translates to half marsh, when technically it is a half vegetated marsh, and even at that may not be correct, because while half the marsh is emergent vegetation that grows up out of the substrate and above the water, the open water areas are likely often filled with submerged aquatic vegetation like milfoil, coontail, Canada waterweed, and pondweeds. Further, there may be some floating aquatics too, like white and yellow water lily. So the reality is that most of the wetland is actually vegetated, just that 50% of the area is in what we call, hemi-marsh vertical structure, right? Or I've also called these sturdy emergents. This stage can last only a few years, or it can last up to 10 or more sometimes. It depends on the life cycle of the vegetation and possibly muskrat activity. During this period, you would typically hold water up to 3 feet deep, but not much more, and the majority of your wetlands should be between 1 to 1.5 feet for maximum bird diversity and to encourage muskrat colonization. The wetland should stay wet year-round with some fluctuations seasonally, but stable water levels during winter for muskrats to colonize, build huts, and survive winter. Rapidly fluctuating water levels in winter or dry conditions for more than 25% of the year are not conducive to muskrat colonization. Too dry makes them susceptible to mink predation, and too high in winter floods them out of their huts that they need to survive. This period that people typically call the hemi-marsh period can produce some breeding duck habitat, but less duck food than the drawn-down moist soil phase that comes later in this cycle. The food comes in the form of seeds and tubers from perennial plants, SAV, and invertebrates. Typical species using this period of the emergent marsh cycle will include all dabbling ducks for isolation and forming pair bonds in the non-breeding season, but widgeon, gadwall, and shovelers are your most common visitors for foraging. However, because the substrate or bottom of the wetland has not seen air for several years, and plants grow, die, and decompose each year, the nutrients increasingly are locked up and not available for plants to use. The wetland begins to degrade. plant diversity declines. You will start to see a drop-off in duck activity in the fall because the food resources are declining. It very often gets taken over by cattail that tends to thrive in stable water conditions. While maybe not of great interest to some duck hunters, the marsh bird community such as rails, bitterns, piebald grebes, common gallinules, also called mudhens, black terns, and other water birds like herons and egrets become increasingly abundant. Some of these, like Virginia rails, sora, also a rail, and gallinules, also technically a rail that looks somewhat like another rail species, the coot. All of these species are actually huntable in most places, but please do check your regulations. All right, though, because the nutrients are locked up in the bottom of the wetland, the quality starts to decline further. Invertebrates become less abundant, and sometimes muskrats invade and begin to eat the cattail. In a few years, rat populations can go from a dozen or so active huts to hundreds of huts, eating the cattail and opening up the marsh. If you don't get muskrat colonization, you can get caught with dense cattail that is very hard to control. Or if you hold water really high, like greater than 3 feet across much of your wetland, then you can often drown cattail to set it back, even in the absence of muskrats. But either way, let's go with the marsh moving towards lake stage at this point. Here, your density of duck foods plummets, and you might still get things like ringnecks and some mergansers and the occasional mallard just because they're generalists. But for the most part, this will be the low point of your plant and bird diversity in the emergent marsh cycle. At this point, as muskrats continue to eat out the marsh, you will have greater than 70% open water, and typically more than 90% with only a rim of vegetation on the higher edges remaining. The closer you are to 70% open water rather than like 90% or more open water, and having mostly cattail for vegetation remaining, when you do a drawdown, the more likely you are to have cattail coming back faster. So it depends on your goals. You can wait one more year for a drawdown. If you wait one more year, muskrat numbers are going to be really declining, as indicated by the number of active huts, just because there isn't material for hut building, but also little food in the form of cattail roots. But even with this decline, the remaining rats should clear up an additional 20% of that cattail or so, providing a very open lake stage situation. Now you treat the wetland just like a moist soil unit as previously discussed today. Drawdown timing matters, but if you want mostly annual grasses and broadleaves like your wild millets, annual smartweed, pigweed, goosefoot, foxtail, bidens, and others, you will need to dry out your wetland by mid-growing season. Again, slowly removing a single board at a time creates a more diverse plant community, which is more nutritious for the ducks. So let a section green up, then pull another board. And continue to do this until you have all the water off of your wetland other than in the borrow ditch. In that first year of that drawdown, if you have water plantain in your area and have a wet summer with low depressions in your wetland, you can get a good crop of water plantain, which is an excellent duck food. The problem with water plantain is that you have to recognize that you have it early in the process and hold water just under its feet for about a month in summer. If you dry out the wetland too much, you'll lose this plant to other aggressive annuals that will crowd it out as it struggles to grow in the hot, drying summer sun. Again, here you see the need to have knowledge of plants as well as monitoring regularly during the growing season. This includes getting out of your truck and into the wetland to see what plants are germinating. In the first year drawdown, you also might start to get some perennials starting to creep in very slowly, right? Among the first of these might be rice cutgrass, which likes it a bit wetter. So it takes advantage of that first year to germinate and start to establish. You can encourage this plant in future years by doing a partial drawdown in year 2, maybe even year 3, because rice cutgrass spreads by seed and underground runners. As a perennial, it actually produces abundant seed, more so than most perennials, right? We often encourage it by only dewatering in year 2 by maybe 25 to 50% of the wetland. However, this also can encourage cattail to come back faster than you would like. So you really got to adapt to what you're seeing on each individual wetland in the emergent marsh cycle. So once you've grown all this great vegetation, each late summer and early fall, follow the directions we provided earlier about rewatering moist soil wetlands and managing vegetation. Remember, do not mow down or disc down green vegetation to open up your wetland before rewatering unless you have no other choice. That is just removing food resources for the ducks before the plant has set seed and is at shatter stage. Again, ducks are short, so rewater in stages and rewater shallow. You don't have to fill your wetland to its gills in 1 week. Most of the time, river flooding is happening later after the growing season is completed anyway. One thing many of y'all don't realize is just how much water green plants are taking up and pushing into the atmosphere through a process called translocation. Just watch sometime how quickly river and wetland levels can come up, even with a small rain, once all the plants have browned down, once they've shut down, once trees have dropped their leaves and are no longer pulling water, processing it to grow, and putting it into the atmosphere. You're much better off trying to rewater after plants start to senesce or shut down than before. That said, you should probably set the stage by getting the soil wet so it doesn't just act like a sponge when you need to try to rewater heavily once plants fully shut down. Okay, so you've done all that work. You grew a diverse annual duck food producing plant community. You've revitalized the perennial plant community by exposing the soil and releasing all those locked up nutrients. You've prepped your vegetation for duck season by making openings. You then added water slowly throughout the hunting season, but kept that water relatively shallow, most of it in knee boot or lower depth. You had ducks respond. Duck hunters had a great season, seeing ducks over the duck food that you produced. Now what? Depending on where you are at, you may have ducks right through winter, but most northern locales freeze up at some point. Hold that water stable through about late April to May or even early June of the next growing season and then repeat. At this point, it all depends on how quickly that perennial plant community and specifically cattail creeps back in and fills the marsh. But you can sometimes keep the marsh in this drawdown moist soil cycle for about 3 years. Sometimes it transitions back to mostly perennials in just 1 year, but you have to read your own marsh, and I'd say when cattail is 50% or greater of the area, then hold water back on the marsh and the entire cycle starts again. At this first year that you hold water through the growing season, you will see the greatest invertebrate density because the nutrients have been released from the soil and all that great decomposing annual plant vegetation makes a lot of places for bugs to live and eat. It's also important to note here that this is why the prairie pothole region is so productive in the years just after drought, when the water comes back to the prairies. Why duck populations can increase nearly exponentially. It's not just about how many ducks there are coming back, but also their capacity to obtain resources from those potholes. They are just super productive, like way more productive than the permanent and semi-permanent wetlands. Again, dabbling ducks and very much mallards are puddle specialists when it comes to obtaining breeding season nutrition. Okay, so back to the emergent marsh cycle story. There is certainly more to this cycle. Like that first year drawdown and the mud flats it makes are great places for late migrating ducks and other cool birds like shorebirds if you do that drawdown in early to mid-spring. There's an entire suite of perennial plants, some good, some bad, to monitor during the growing season. The Phragmites might creep in, and that needs to be controlled as soon as possible. There are many nuances to the emergent marsh cycle, but the main thing you need to be is adaptive. You should keep a monitoring log and record of what timing of drawdowns was, what the plant and animal response was, and be prepared to adapt. You may have a plan in place, but weather that is either very dry or very wet during the growing season can make you change those plans. Be okay with that. Mostly the within-season monitoring is as important, if not more important, than it is for southern folks that are typically using dedicated moist soil units. Dedicated moist soil units at northern latitudes are a thing too. We even have them right in our backyard of Jack's Reef on public lands, but they are also typically places just converted from agriculture into moist soil wetlands with the capacity to drive equipment on easily. Many emergent marshes from the prairies across the Great Lakes and into southern Canada and the northeast U.S. are just too mucky and wet for equipment. But you will be surprised how much the bottom of a wetland can and will oxidize and consolidate when dried out for a few years. If you have a marsh that hasn't been drawn down for decades and is basically a fishing pond and has a deep layer of mud at the bottom, don't give up on it for equipment. Many times after a few years of drying that bottom, it becomes hard enough to support equipment. So if you show up to a place that hasn't been actively managed using drawdowns at appropriate times in the emergent marsh cycle, don't give up on it. Those marshes are extremely resilient and meant to be dynamic, so start ripping out and putting in boards. You'll be surprised what you can produce. In part 3 of the FowlWeather Podcast Wetland Management Series, we will meet with a wetland manager from Arkansas to dig deep into the weeds. Pun intended, right? Dig deep into the weeds about the realities of wetland management and how to put more ducks in front of your blind. Thanks for joining us. And as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.